naval ships at sea, and control of sea routes was vital in the struggle for victory. But even more important, oil could fuel aircraft. And refueling in mid-air could increase the scope of bombers to bring death and destruction over a wider area. So, as a weapon of war, and increasingly the major prize of war, there were huge profits to be made by those who owned the oil. But where does a multinational oil company stand in time of war?
Whenever you get either a war or an embargo, you get that conflict inside a multinational oil company, in which the question of where its loyalties lie then has to become uppermost. In wartime, does it then show its loyalty to the country where it is based, or does it continue to trade with countries which could be closely supplying the enemy?
It was this question of ultimate loyalty that shaped the growth of the oil industry in Europe. For if Rockefeller's Standard Oil of America was rightly called the first multinational, it was closely followed by a European company whose operations were even more global, the Royal Dutch Shell Group. Shell's roots came not from exploration and production, but rather from the high seas as an oil trader and transporter.
Slow ahead, please.
Today, Shell comes second only to the mighty Exxon as the biggest company in the world. The global rivalry between Shell and Exxon, derived from Rockefeller's Standard Oil, has lasted almost a century. A Japanese tanker carrying oil from the North Sea puts into Rotterdam, the nearest thing to a home port for the Shell Oil Company. But even here in Holland, Shell faces fierce competition from all the major companies, Britain's BP, and from the US majors. The same symbols can be seen in every port in the world. The global transportation of oil has produced tanker fleets that dwarf the navies of many nations. Rotterdam was always a great oil trading port from the early links Shell forged with the producers in the Dutch East Indies. It is still one of the world's major refining centers.
Oh, beep, beep, beep.
Rotterdam symbolizes the industry's vast investments in engineering and equipment. But whereas the Dutch port represents old world stability, oil remains at heart the most political industry, exposed to unpredictable countries around the world, never sure where it really belongs. But oil today is the great global economic force. Yet another reason why the role of the oil companies in wartime or embargo was to become so critical. The famous Shell sign symbolizes a more flexible international currency, even than gold or diamonds. For Shell is everywhere, virtually in every country in the world. And where selling oil to the Arabs might seem paradoxical, producing lubricating oil for Saudi Arabia from this canning plant in Rotterdam is routine to a multinational like Shell. As routine as producing petrochemicals for Holland from this Shell refinery at Jubail in Saudi Arabia. Shell's global strategy started from small beginnings. In the East End of London, where the family of Marcus Samuel had made a modest fortune, selling jewel boxes fashioned from exotic seashells from the Far East. In 1892, with the Russian oil fields opening up, Samuel commissioned a new range of low-draft tankers to ship Russian oil through the Suez Canal. The tankers, all named after seashells, soon allowed Samuel to undercut Rockefeller's Standard Oil. In 1897, he founded the Shell Transport and Trading Company, his connection with seashells remaining only in the title. Meanwhile, in the Dutch East Indies, a former bank clerk from Amsterdam was cutting his own business teeth with a little company called Royal Dutch. His name was Henry Detterding. The Dutch and the British were among the first to explore for oil in Burma and Sumatra, and as the US oil industry was growing in Pennsylvania and Texas, so European oil expertise was being won in the jungles of the Far East. In 1903, Detterding and Samuel merged their respective companies to create Royal Dutch Shell, a formidable challenge to Rockefeller's Standard Oil. The young Detterding took the helm as the first managing director, while Samuel became more involved in public life, eventually ending up as the Lord Mayor of London. The young Winston Churchill was to declare that the substitution of the internal combustion engine for the horse marked a gloomy milestone in the progress of mankind. But he was among the first to recognize the military implications of oil. He had just been appointed First Lord of the Admiralty and was persuaded by Admiral Sir John Fisher, the First Sea Lord, to test the efficiency of oil for powering warships. He was present at the trials when the engines of the HMS Hannibal were switched from coal to oil. The result was a fiasco, with thick black smoke obliterating everything. But Churchill needed little convincing that oil was the way of the future for powering warships. And although he was sold on oil, he was far from sold on Shell oil, even less on Standard's American oil. In a jingoistic speech to Parliament in June 1914, Churchill argued that foreign-owned companies would always put commercial advantage above Britain's strategic interest. "We have no quarrel with Shell," he said. "We have always found them ready to oblige, at a price. And on that point we've been treated with the full rigor of the game. We cannot run the risk of getting into the hands of these very good people."
And Churchill made absolutely clear in his own statements that he was not going to be tied to an ordinary commercial oil company. And this was the beginning, if you like, of the continuing argument that's been going on ever since. It went on during every war, it went on during the Falklands, it went on through the oil embargo of '73, when successive political leaders were determined again that they should be independent of that international, multinational oil market and oil pricing system.
The solution to Britain's problem, with war looming and no supplies of her own, was to come not from America or Russia, nor from the Far East, but from a land whose oil potential had been charted in the Bible itself. The burning sands of Nebuchadnezzar still ignite as the gases escape from the desert in modern Iran. But in the early 1900s, few saw the potential of the lands around the Persian Gulf. This was Bedouin country. The oil that seeped to the surface near the Euphrates and Tigris rivers was thought to have no commercial significance, although the locals had been using it for cooking, waterproofing and building for centuries. It was in the remote border area of Chir Suk, between Persia and Iraq, that the first oil prospectors began work in the early years of the new century. The wild hill country of the Zagros Mountains became home for for the crew and their field manager, an English geologist called George Reynolds. always accompanied by his faithful terrier. It took 16 months to complete the first well, a dry hole. But still, Reynolds and his crew worked on through extremes of heat and cold, through plague and bitter disappointment, manhandling the heavy drilling equipment when engines and mules seized up. By 1907, Reynolds' main backer, William Knox D'Arcy, was running out of money. When funds finally did run out in April 1908, he cabled Reynolds, telling him to stop work. But Reynolds ignored the cable and carried on drilling. On May the 26th, he finally brought in the first commercial well in the Middle East, the Majid-e-Suleiman. Reynolds cabled the news home to Knox D'Arcy in appropriate biblical code. See Psalm 104, verse 15, which being translated read, "That he may bring out of the earth oil to make a cheerful countenance." With only months to go before the outbreak of war, Parliament voted to acquire Knox D'Arcy's Anglo-Persian Company. The British Petroleum Company of today is the direct descendant of Knox D'Arcy's Anglo-Persian. Outside the front entrance of Britannic House, the company headquarters in the City of London, still stands the original wellhead of the Majid-e-Suleiman field, a monument to British wealth created from a far-off land. And still scattered on the desert sand, despite all that's taken place in the 80 intervening years, the rusting symbols of the oil strike that laid the foundation of Britain's victory in the Great War, as well as the foundation of Middle East oil dominance for the rest of the century. Finding the oil was a personal triumph for Reynolds. Getting it to the market was a triumph of teamwork and engineering skills for the newly formed Anglo-Persian Oil Company. A 130-mile pipeline was laid between Majid-e-Suleiman and a mudflat at the head of the Arabian Gulf, called Abadan. By 1913, tankers were uplifting oil from the refinery. When war broke out a year later, Churchill had already signed a contract under which the Royal Navy was guaranteed oil supplies from Anglo-Persian. The fleet would never be held to ransom. This was to be the war to end all wars. It was warfare on a previously unimagined scale. The day of the foot soldier was coming to a bloody, if prolonged, end in the trenches of northern France. Oil was transforming the way wars were waged, as surely as it was transforming transportation itself. Probably the first example of oil-powered transportation in warfare was when the French army commandeered the Paris taxis to ferry their troops to the Battle of the Marne. And later, London buses were pressed into service to bring victorious troops back from the front. For the wounded, too, warfare was changing. They could be removed more quickly from the field of battle as ambulances became motorized. It was Churchill who took the initiative of warfare away from the infantry and the cavalry. He persevered with the tank against all the advice of the military commanders of the day. And just as oil was the difference between victory and defeat at sea, so the petrol-fueled tanks proved the real winners in the Flanders mud. Another deadly new weapon was beginning to make its presence felt. Suddenly, horse soldiers were as outmoded as bows and arrows in a new kind of warfare, where the cavalry was swept from the battlefields by oil-fueled flying machines. When victory finally came, Britain was better placed than virtually any of the other combatant nations for oil supplies, apart from Russia and America. At the end of the war, Britain and France were more united than at any time in their history, but united, above all, in their determination to share in the fruits of victory, especially the former Ottoman Empire. At the Treaty of San Remo in 1919, Britain and France literally carved up the Middle East. Mesopotamia, now called Iraq, fell to Britain. France got Syria. Britain, of course, already controlled Iran. Much of the carve-up was done in secret. Almost too late, the Americans realized they were being shut out of the most lucrative oil bonanza in history. But President Hoover demanded an open-door policy for the Middle East, so the U.S. could share in the carve-up.
The idea of the open door, as it was always called, which the Americans insisted on in the Middle East, was something that they believed in passionately until they were inside themselves. And as soon as they got through the open door, of course, the door closed behind them.
Running Royal Dutch Shell's operation in The Hague was the man who had fought hardest to exclude America from the Middle East, and who'd seen his company's European monopoly broken by Anglo-Persian, Henry Detterding, now emerging as the most dynamic oil man since John D. Rockefeller.
I found him a very fascinating character. He had very lively, sort of penetrating dark eyes. He laughed a lot. He was amusing. There was something effervescent about him. He had a tremendous charm, and he was a very respected person and a very person.
American cartoonists had depicted John D. Rockefeller in a stained glass window as St. John of the Rocks. Similarly, in The Hague, Detterding's achievements in Shell's growth were depicted in stained glass from the company's humblest beginnings. From an industry founded on shipping kerosene from Sumatra, Shell's global operations now included exploration, production, refining, canning, shipping, and marketing. It was in selling oil that Detterding's genius lay, selling to an ever-growing international market. But his global operations went much further than Europe, and by the 20s, Detterding was contemplating his boldest move yet.
He felt that a group like the Shell Group would never be an important organization unless they also had a foothold in the United States, which is, after all, the most important oil country in the world, and not only started importing petroleum products from the Dutch East Indies, but also buying oil leases and eventually becoming a full-fledged oil company in the United States of exploration and production, refining and marketing.
But competing in Standard Oil's own backyard only made sense when supplies were limited. Detterding knew that competing in a flooded market meant everybody lost money. It was the oil glut of the 20s that wrote one of the world's most unlikely locations into oil field history. Ostensibly, Detterding had arranged a holiday in the Highlands of Scotland, at Achnacarry Castle. It was the glorious 12th of August, 1928, the start of the grouse shooting season.
Good dog. Good dog.
A party of international businessmen arrived at the castle, led by the newly knighted Sir Henry Detterding. As far as the public was concerned, they'd come to the wild hills of Lochiel, heartland of the Clan Cameron, to shoot grouse. The present clan chief, Sir Donald Cameron, was only 17 at the time.
First that I personally knew about it was when I read in the newspaper that some people were here who were rather mysterious and having secret meetings. And there was a great headline in one of the more enterprising newspapers who talked about the secret meeting between Sir Henry Detterding and other oil kings in Achnacarry, in a little antlered castle right in the wilds of the Highlands.
With him, Sir Henry brought the two other most powerful oilmen in the world, Sir John Cadman of BP and Walter Teagle of Standard Oil.
Then I heard that the postmistress, who was the gardener's wife, had one day received a telegram of 100 words in Dutch, which she naturally found a little hard to translate. And that obviously made it quite clear that it was an international gathering of everyone. And we took more interest. And I heard from the keeper that they had been out shooting once or twice, but they didn't get very many birds.
The history of the oil business had previously been one of ferocious competition. So why would the three main industry rivals get together to shoot grouse?
But it's all here in the game books, which I think I can probably find for you, the entry. 1928. Yes, here it is. It's the game books all in my father's handwriting, because he, of course, was living here at the time. I only just left school. And he was very meticulous in making the entries in the game book. And here it is, 1928-29. It says at the bottom, Sir Henry Detterding was tenant of Achnacarry from 1st of August to 31st, with grouse shooting and fishing. He was only out one day and a few hours, so they can't have taken their shooting very seriously.
Clearly, the grouse had little to worry about. Sir Henry and his global counterparts were after much bigger game. Nothing less than the first pricing system for world oil.
I've got no doubt that the real significance of Achnacarry was that it created a framework of carving out the world oil market. And it was really represented in those two words, as is, which was what the agreement was called, the as is agreement. It was an attempt which worked to fix the world price of oil and to make certain that undercutters would be kept out of the market. And it was an extremely well-arranged and well-ordered international cartel, one of the most effective cartels that we've seen in the world.
The main outcome of Achnacarry was the Gulf Plus pricing system, a method of charging those who were not in the cartel as if the oil had been freighted all the way from the Texas coast. So if a customer in Karachi, for example, bought oil from a member of the cartel, the oil would probably be supplied by BP's nearby Persian fields. But in addition to the delivery price, the customer would be charged a phantom freight cost, as if the oil had come all the way from Galveston on the Texas Gulf Coast, where production costs were more expensive in any case. Thus, the three most powerful oil companies in the world had achieved an effective price and supply structure. Although it covered only those producing countries outside Russia and the United States, at the time about 30% of the market.
But of course that 30% was absolutely crucial, because that was the international market. And it was the ability to fix the price for that 30% and to make certain that cheap oil that was coming out of Russia and other parts of the world should then be priced as if it was American oil. That was the essence of the whole agreement, which of course became so much more significant when more cheap oil was discovered later on.
By 1936, the world was coming out of depression. Germany in particular seemed to reflect the new confidence abroad. The German Olympics were to be the great symbol of Aryan prowess. The Nazi cult of white supremacy could no longer be ignored. Under Hitler, industrial production was soaring. In Holland, Royal Dutch Shell too appeared to be putting more emphasis on sporting contests. Detterding's own virtues of strong leadership and loyal teamwork began to dominate as his employees went through their paces at this company sports festival. The most powerful figure in world oil was now undeniably Sir Henry Detterding.
To me, being Dutch, I have honestly have a soft spot for Detterding, who was born in the same city as I am. Detterding was boyish, and people compared him to a glass of champagne. He was extrovert, he was jovial, he loved the great outdoors.
Shell staff were encouraged to see themselves as members of a kind of company state. But while Detterding inspired loyalty among his workforce, his increasingly autocratic behavior began to worry many of his senior colleagues.
I think he became an admirer of the regime in Germany, and I think his colleagues, both in Holland and in the UK, worried about it. I don't believe personally that he was a convinced, what one would call a Nazi.
To honor him when he left the company in 1937 or 1936 with this sports festival, to me has absolutely nothing to do with fascism or Nazism.
But the sight of several hundred loyal employees prostrate at his feet, spelling out the name Detterding with their bodies under a fluttering swastika, caused grave concern. Detterding's lifestyle, too, was coming under criticism. His womanizing, the big spending. But it was the apparent public demonstrations of sympathy to the Nazis, scenes like this prize-giving ceremony, for example, that caused the greatest embarrassment.
If you look carefully, you will see that he had a tennis elbow and that on the right arm, and that the joint was stiff. He shakes hands with his left hand with the people. I think that if somebody said hello to him, he said hello to the other party.
But if we look at the film again, he doesn't shake hands with the left hand. He doesn't appear to have tennis elbow. And the salute looks uncomfortably like Sieg Heil.
I don't have much doubt that Detterding was a Nazi sympathizer, if not an actual member of the party. He was also rather mad. His own book reveals a megalomania which is unusual even in the oil business, and a definite fascist or dictatorial streak which became much more serious in his later years.
Detterding's simplistic political philosophy was spelled out in his autobiography, An International Oil Man, in which he advocated that if he were dictator of the world, he would shoot all idlers at sight.
The fact is that he had a view of the world which depended on dictatorial control. He hated the idea of people having ordinary democratic rights to be different and to defy his orderly system, and the Nazis were a natural companion, if you like, for him.
By the late 30s, war was obviously coming, and there were fears within Shell about the way Detterding's right-wing sympathies might be interpreted. As Churchill had foreseen, multinationals prefer to hold on to their neutrality as long as possible when conflicts erupt among their nation customers. Now, as Hitler's power continued to grow, Detterding seemed oblivious to the threat the Nazis posed to his position or that of his company. By 1937, he was effectively ousted from the company, just as Shell unveiled this bust in his honor.
Shell is still acutely embarrassed by the Detterding rule. They still don't like to mention Detterding in their histories except extremely briefly, and they don't like to remember the extent to which the company was in fact run by a brigand who was also an oil man of genius. And this, if you like, is one of the problems of the oil industry, that these geniuses leave a tremendously heavy and stormy wake behind them.
Anybody who drove as hard as he did naturally leaves some scars, some sore places behind him, and this was certainly true of Detterding. And I suppose there was a natural reaction to that, and a certain amount of resentment and a tendency to forget Detterding. But now I think, it's nearly 50 years since his death, I think that one can see him much more in the round and realize what an enormous contribution he made, not only to the formation and the early successes of the group, but to the industry as a whole.
Detterding died only 6 months before war broke out, and as the Times reported, both Hitler and Goering sent wreaths to his funeral.
The Nazis took advantage at the funeral to make a big show of it, apparently, and Goering was president. And it was rather embarrassing, but I think from 1936 onwards, Detterding didn't play a role in the management of the company anymore.
With the outbreak of the Second World War, it was again obvious that there would be a huge demand for oil. Germany had virtually no oil of its own, but Hitler desperately needed oil to fuel his war machine. The oil companies had their own problems at the start of the European war. 5 of the majors were based in the United States, which at the time was not at war with Germany, and the companies were loath to lose their lucrative German contracts.
But it wasn't only Shell, of course, that was embarrassed by the Second World War and by some links with the Nazis. Perhaps the most extreme case was Texaco, who even before the war were defying the ban by Roosevelt on supplying oil to Franco during the Civil War. And then, at the worst point of the war for Britain, just after the fall of France in 1940, there was a German agent who came to New York called Dr. Vestrick, whose salary was paid by Texaco during his stay and much of his entertainment too, and he'd come over to get support from American businessmen for the Nazi war effort and to stop them selling arms to the British. And Texaco were in the lead there because, of course, like many businessmen at the time, they thought that the Germans would win and Britain would lose, and they wanted to be on the winning side.
Here again, the dilemma of the multinational oil company in time of war. Which takes precedence, loyalty to country or loyalty to shareholders?
But Texaco have always been, if you like, the most straightforwardly commercial of the companies. They've been reviled and attacked for some of their rather shady political liaisons, but in some ways I think they've been the most honest about their purely commercial approach to the oil business. They haven't pretended to be statesmen or patriots, but they're simply making and selling oil.
The longest surviving member of Churchill's coalition from these dark days was Lord Shinwell, the veteran Labour MP. How did he view the apparent immorality of the oil companies in time of war?
Immoral, immoral. What do they mean by that? What do they care? As an ordinary politician, you do. But suppose you become a leader, a prime minister, or the head of a multinational company. Do mortals come into it? I'm not sure. I doubt it. You've got to do the best you can for your company. You do sometimes the most immortal things in doing so.
There was no legal sanctions. Those companies in America, or based in America, who continued to trade with Germany, were perfectly entitled to do so. And of course, you must remember that these companies had very big local establishments in Germany. And those establishments, because Germany is very ill supplied with indigenous sources of crude oil, those companies were relying on their parent companies to keep them supplied. So that in the interests of the shareholders and in the interests of being good citizens of the countries in which they were established, they had to do their best to keep their supplies up coming into Germany.
If, as Lord Curzon claimed, the Allies floated to victory on a wave of oil in the First World War, the Nazis were determined to cut oil supplies by sea to Britain in the Second War. The toll in Allied shipping was heavy.
A sidelight on the Battle of the Atlantic. In fair weather or foul, the ships of our Navy have to be refueled.
By using ever more ingenious methods of refueling warships at sea, the Navy was able then to keep up their watchdog role round the clock.
And a tow line is hoisted aboard. When the two ships are in tow, the oil pipe is hauled across. The pipe is coupled up and the pumps set in motion. Soon another of His Majesty's ships will be on its way with scarcely a pause in its stride. Blame the U-boat. Blame Hitler's submarine attacks against Allied shipping for the petrol shortage. America, the biggest oil-producing country in the world, clamps down on private motoring for pleasure, limiting 8 million car owners to a small weekly allowance. The ration card system puts an end to the individual whose war effort amounts to flying a flag on the radiator of a limousine.
Okay, it's an A card, 3 gallons.
Motorists in the United States had been completely unaffected by World War I. Once the U.S. came into World War II, the growing millions of American motorists faced petrol rationing for the first time.
Petrol is for the frontliners. It's the driving force upon which every lorry, plane, and tank depends. The precious liquid which the armed forces need to cut loose on Hitler.
One of the most important derivatives of oil in wartime was synthetic rubber. While Germany was always short of rubber, the Allies were able to keep their vehicles well shod. And there were some fairly imaginative uses of the abundant supplies of synthetics.
Of course, it's a decoy, but it fooled the enemy many times, making their planes waste bombs. And a gun which at a distance looks quite real. When you're ready to move, it'll fit into a suitcase.
But the real tanks needed oil as well, and their winning role in World War I was developed still further in World War II.
Mr. Churchill sponsored the introduction of the tank into modern warfare, so one can understand his interest in their development. The Prime Minister inspects newer types of tanks and armored cars from Canada and the USA. With the homemade products, they'll help to end the war.
It is, of course, rather fascinating to reflect that, in a way, the whole Middle East oil business started just before the First War, when Churchill was far-sighted enough to buy into Anglo-Persian, as it then was, in order to secure supplies for the British Navy. And there he was, in charge of things again in the Second War, this time as Prime Minister, and just as keen as ever to see that that security of supply was maintained. And this is why I'm sure he made such a tremendous feature of the Desert War and the need to protect the lifelines through the Middle East at all costs.
When you've got a situation where some is appointed to take charge of military affairs, and he starts off in Cairo and goes to Tobruk and goes right along the coast to Morocco and takes possession and forces the enemy out and gradually captures the oil resources in that area and further afield from that area. When he does that, that is a contribution in oil to victory.
A pipeline under the Channel, a British engineering achievement which will rank as the Operation Mulberry of the battle for oil. The invention and manufacture of the lifeline, which carried petrol for the Allied armies in Europe, is a work of genius. Tribute is due to Mr. Geoffrey Lloyd, Minister in charge of the Petroleum Warfare Department. Constructed somewhat like a submarine electric power cable without the cores and insulation, this pipeline makes engineering history.
A pipeline under the ocean, Pluto from its initials, was perhaps the most original example of the use of oil in wartime. It came after the Desert War had been fought and won by the Allies, and as the Second Front was about to begin.
The finished cable is loaded into circular tanks built into the converted coasters and tankers, which are to take it across the channel. From the holds of these ships, like some fabulous snake-like monster, the pipeline begins its cross-channel trek.
The pipeline, which ran under the English Channel, was vitally important if the Allied troops in France were to be kept supplied with fuel for tanks and transport. Pluto was literally the life support system of the Allied war machine in Europe.
For Allied armor and transport, links Dungeness to Boulogne. High-pressure pumping stations were cleverly camouflaged in seaside bungalows, a holiday camp, and an old fort. 1 million gallons of petrol a day were being pumped across land and sea from the Mersey to the Rhine. Field Marshal von Rundstedt and other enemy generals now in captivity have admitted that our stupendous lead in oil supplies was a major cause of their defeat. Operation Pluto, shrouded in mystery for 2.5 years, was more than a magnificent British feat of engineering. Its success undoubtedly speeded the end of the war in Europe.
I don't believe there ever was a time when Churchill, with his vast knowledge of politics, when he didn't realize that the element of oil was a very important ingredient in victory. Without it, it's very difficult. But the very fact that he backed the aircraft up to the extent he did.
A special target of RAF Bomber Command has been the Sterfrader synthetic oil plant. The refineries are now a wilderness.
And not only were the Allied land forces well supplied with oil, but in the air too, with no fuel problems, Allied bombers were able to press home their attacks on Germany's dwindling supplies.
Serving this huge spider's web of war factories was the biggest inland dock system in Germany, linking the Rhine and the Ruhr. Every loading center had its own rail yard working day and night, pumping oil supplies into the Reich. Now the tugs and barges are here to stay.
VE Day, 8th of May, 1945. Prime Minister Winston Churchill arrives at Buckingham Palace. A grateful Britain, led by the royal family, pays homage to the man who led her through her darkest hours. Twice within 30 years, the world had gone to war, and twice victory had gone to the side best able to use the oil weapon. In 1945, Churchill was seen as the difference between victory and defeat. But perhaps his greatest contribution to victory in both wars had been first in recognizing the potential of oil, and then in guaranteeing Britain her own independent supplies. With the war behind them, the oil companies could now get down to the battle of grabbing a bigger slice of the market. The Allies had floated to victory on a wave of oil, but among the major inheritors of that victory were the oil companies themselves.
How could you use a poor maid? And so, every woman I know, crazy about automobiles. Every woman I know, crazy about automobiles.
For the GIs and Tommies coming home from the front, the spoils of victory included a big shiny automobile, preferably with a big shiny blonde up front. The oil companies were not slow to make the connection. Oil plus automobiles plus sex added up to profits.
And here I am standing with nothing but a rubber heel. Now look here. Let's say walking women home is a thing of the past. Women walk.
Soon a new war was raging, a price war, as the oil companies battled for the privilege of keeping the new wave of gas guzzlers supplied. And no matter what fancy extras you had on your limo, it simply wouldn't go without gas.
Believe it or not, we've captured a tiger.
What is your petrol? Super Shell.
And the global protagonists for half a century, Esso and Shell especially, now fought their earlier battles through television advertising.
Super Shell and go.
The advertiser is saying that Esso Extra will give your car the speed and power of a tiger.
But so there really is a tiger.
Nonsense, boy. Nonsense. Goodness gracious.
Here's the oil that's right for you. Esso Extra motor oil.
All in at the Esso site.
What a day, feeling swell. Hey, say, Mr. Shell, let's do the down on Shell, Shell, Shell.
I'm with you, Sammy.
Well, hop right in.
John D. Rockefeller would have been aghast at what had happened to his well-ordered oil market. As for his European rival Detterding, Shell had moved a long way from his pre-war sympathies. Now, a self-styled, one-eyed Jewish Negro was extolling their virtues in song.
There goes my horse, last round the course, but I've got my shirt on Shell. Just made the show with a minute to go. You're always there on Shell, Shell, Shell. Keep going well, keep going Shell. You can be sure of Shell. Keep going well, keep going Shell. You can be sure of Shell. What a gas.
And if the advertising battles of the late 40s and 50s brought relief after the grim realities of war, there was no denying the new reality. It was the automobile, the open road, and a sky that never saw rain. All over the world, it seemed, the Esso sign meant happy motoring, and you could drive well on Shell to virtually every corner of the globe. But other signs were beginning to appear on the highways. New suitors clamored for the motorists' affections. The Allies had won the war. Now the multinational oil companies were set to win the peace. It was the Italian patriot Enrico Mattei who first christened the major oil companies Le Sette Sorelle, the Seven Sisters. The Seven Sisters of Greek mythology were turned by their father, the god Zeus, into stars, fated to shine in the night sky for all eternity. Like the neon symbols of the major oil companies in the post-war years, Esso, Mobil, Chevron, Gulf, Texaco, BP, and Shell.
They compete with each other like hell. When it comes to the market and competition, they hate each other, but definitely they cooperate, sometimes behind the scenes.
Well, I think it was Carlos Gulbenkian who first said that the oil companies were rather like cats. You never know whether they're fighting or making love. There's always been that element of ambiguity, if you like, in that relationship, because sometimes they are competing ferociously, of course, at the pumps, but there's no doubt in the producing countries they were getting together and carving out quite large parts of the world.
The most powerful of all cats symbolizes the most powerful of all industries. The tiger, as an advertising vehicle, was invented by Esso, or, as it is known in the United States, the Exxon Corporation, the fattest cat among the major oil companies, and the biggest company of any kind in the world.
Tenacity, inventiveness, imagination, and experience. We know. We've been here right from the start.
Well, the Tiger's been around a long time with our company. In post-World War II, we first started using the Tiger in the United Kingdom in about 1950, somewhere in the mid-50s. In 1964, and looking around for a product advertising program or campaign in the U.S., we adopted the cartoon tiger.
The tiger went on to become the most potent advertising symbol in history.
Believe it or not, we've captured a tiger.
This is Bundy, the Esso tiger, with his trainer Madeline, rehearsing a commercial outside Los Angeles.
Oh, good.
Well, the tiger symbolizes beauty, grace, majesty, strength, dignity.
Easy, easy, don't do that.
And the very essence of the tiger makes it easy to communicate these things in a commercial in a short few seconds.
The tiger became a symbol not just for Esso, but for all the 7 major oil companies, who, at the height of their power, dominated not only oil, but world commerce itself. The industry spent millions promoting an image of itself as trustworthy, reliable, the motorist's powerful friend. Here, Bundy goes through his paces. His trainers control him by keeping him well fed. But not even they turn their backs on him. Like the oil companies, the tiger is not always predictable.
Bundy, you ready? Come on, tiger! Come on, come jump! All right. All right.
Esso cherche.
Oh, that looks really nice.
Esso trouve. Esso, premier producteur de pétrole brut en France. Avec nous, soyez plus exigeants.
Wendy, look. Sit. Touch it.
Oh, easy, that's my hand. That's my hand.
Five of the 7 sisters came from America, appropriately for the country which gave shape to the modern oil industry. 3 were descended from Rockefeller's great Standard Oil empire. Esso, or Exxon, is based on New York's Avenue of the Americas. Mobil, formerly Standard of New York, is based on East 42nd Street. Standard of California, or Chevron from its brand name, is based in San Francisco. Gulf Oil, founded by the Mellon banking family, is based in Pittsburgh. Gulf and Texaco were both born from the famous Spindletop strike of 1901. The 2 European sisters, Shell and BP, look down on Parliament itself from opposite banks of the River Thames in London. Though reflecting its Dutch shareholding, Shell also has headquarters in The Hague. By the late 60s, the 7 sisters were among the world's largest companies. their budgets were frequently bigger than those of the host countries in which they operated. Their tanker fleets rivaled the navies of all but the biggest nations. Being multinational, they could switch operations around the globe and play one nation supplier off against another. By 1970, a quarter of a century after World War II, the sisters still accounted for more than 60% of crude oil production outside the communist bloc. This was made possible by integrated exploration, production, refining, and marketing organizations which allowed total control of supplies from the producing fields to the customer. But the ease with which their giant tankers plied the world trade routes belied the politically fragile world in which they were operating. It also belied the vulnerability of their sources of supply. They competed ferociously with each other for markets, spending millions on advertising what was basically an identical product. Yet they remained interlinked through a network of global joint ventures.
So it's 6-1 on guidelines versus direct.
But from this apparent omnipotence, painstakingly built over the decades, it took only a few short months during 1973 to transform the sisters into villains as Western economies collapsed before the rising oil prices caused by OPEC embargoes. At this U.S. Senate hearing, there was no doubt who the public saw as the guilty men.
I'm G.M. Powell, Vice President, Standard Oil Company of California.
I'm Richard H. Leet, Vice President, Supply and Distribution, Amoco Oil Company, Standard Oil Company, Indiana. And I'm Harold Bridges, President and Chief Executive Officer of Shell Oil Company.
Gentlemen, if you'll be stand and...
The sisters were in the dock as their top executives were lined up for questioning. All 5 American sisters were represented, plus Shell, providing for the first time the public face of big bad oil.
The oil companies have been getting an unusual tax break, not only in the United States, but you oil companies over a period of 30 years have been in a conspiracy, and I use the word conspiracy, with the Middle Eastern oil-producing states.
The Jackson Senate Subcommittee revealed for the first time the details of the so-called golden gimmick, where the American sisters, instead of paying taxes on profits made overseas to the U.S. government, could pay them instead to the host governments of the countries where they were operating.
Sold them on the idea of foreign tax credits. Every payment that you make to an Arab country, you get a credit on the taxes to the United States. In the year 1970, you earned approximately $1 billion for your explorations and your production and sales abroad. And on this $1 billion, you took sufficient credit not to pay one dime to the American Treasury.
The companies, shocked to be on trial at all, tried to defend themselves, but they were bluntly warned not to try to hide any of the facts from a public demanding reasons for the oil shortages.
The same is true of you. And I hope very much, therefore, that you'll exorcise any of these hobgoblins about how little people should know about your business. This is a time when we live in a fishbowl, and so do you, and that you will cooperate with us rather than fight it, because that'll only delay and hurt the public interest in developing the facts so the government can get them and make them public. Otherwise, the people will not believe them. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
But despite the sisters' protests, Jackson dragged their operations into full public gaze. Senator Frank Church's commission into the activities of the multinationals the following year was even more damaging.
What the Church subcommittee did was force American public opinion and the political world to focus upon the fact that we needed a U.S. government policy, that we could not leave it just to the oil companies, that their interests were not the same as the U.S. national interest, that there had to be an explicit consideration of what the United States national interest was and where and when it differed from the interests of the companies.
All of your questions.
Alan Murray was vice president of Mobil Oil during the Senate hearings.
To all the questions, right?
Questions we answered. I don't know what Senator Church came out with, but boy, he couldn't be more off base.
If we're going to have governments run everything, I can't remember anything that I really think governments ran better than private enterprise, particularly in the energy business.
There is a pervasive suspicion among the American people of the oil companies, of government officials, and yes, of the Congress itself. Indeed, anyone who has had anything to do with the decisions which affect international oil is today suspect in the public mind.
All the public knew was that suddenly there was a massive shortage of oil, and they were paying more for it. But instead of blaming the OPEC producers, they instinctively blamed the oil companies. But the story was complex and went back long before the 70s, challenging the whole conspiratorial nature of the companies' interlinked relationships. The Commission's chief legal counsel, Jerome Levinson, sitting on Senator Church's right, knew how important it was that the press should understand the nature of the allegations against the companies.
So I thought, after the first hearing, that we had started in the wrong way and that it was too complicated and we would not be able to get any part of the story across. But I woke up the next morning and I got the New York Times, and to my amazement, there on the front page, as they say, on the left-hand side, above the fold, was a headline which said, the golden handshake of the oil industry revealed for the first time, or words to that effect. In other words, that what I thought had been too technical a story, at least for the television, the reporter for the Times had recognized as revealing for the first time the origins of one of the great financial bonanzas for the oil industry.
And it wasn't only in the U.S. the companies were being attacked in the press. All around the world, the politicians and media saw it as the Seven Sisters in a conspiracy against the public.
Now, why the media chose to do this, why the politicians chose to do this, I just don't know. I guess they wanted to find a conspiracy. Of course, there was none. History has proven there is none, and it is now, because of that, and the media doesn't print that on the first page when they don't find the problem. I think that the knowledgeable people of the nation who really investigated it found out that it was all a big hoax on the American people. There was a shortage, but the hoax was that we were to blame.
It wasn't any nefarious plot, but it was the assumption that the interests of the oil companies were the same as the interests of the U.S. government, so that you could safely leave the management of international oil to the companies because their interests were always going to be parallel to the U.S. national interest. Now, that was the underlying assumption of American international oil policy from 1954 until 1973.
It had taken the oil shortages of 1973 to focus the West's attention on the multinational oil companies. But Enrico Mattei, the Italian patriot who dubbed the Sette Sorelle, the Seven Sisters, as the enemy, had mounted the first serious attempt to crack their monopoly 20 years before. Italy was not an oil producer of any significance, but Mattei saw that it could play a key role on behalf of the consumers between the Sisters cartel and the growing nationalism of the Middle East producers. And it was from a little company producing gas in the Po Valley, Agip, that he single-handedly founded Italy's oil business. Resentment among the producer countries was nothing new. It had surfaced as far back as 1938, when Mexico had nationalized the oil companies operating there. But in Italy, Enrico Mattei was determined to bypass the sisters by bringing oil directly from the producers to the consumers. Soon he had become a hero figure, as Italy, humiliated by war, was beginning the long journey back to economic recovery.
Mattei tried to impersonate the desire of the Italians to have economic development, so to speak. The push of the Italian society towards modernity, towards a new life. It was not only reconstruction after the war. It was the idea that Italy should emerge out of the war and the post-war period as a sort of renewed society, not only richer, but a bit more just, perhaps, and that would take its place into the European concert with a better authority and stronger position. And from this point of view, Mattei was enormously popular in Italy because it was visibly impersonating the role of the development of the economic system and also the political system.
Mattei fought the sisters' monopoly as tirelessly as he had fought fascism during the war. But his main problem, as the sisters pointed out, was that he was an oil man without oil. But with the growing support of the people and a rising sense of Italian nationalism, Mattei was making strenuous efforts to change that situation. First, by striking an independent agreement for oil from Iran. Little by little, he built up a network of supplies for his new Italian state oil company, Eni.
La venue au Maroc de M. Enrico Mattei fera certainement date dans l'évolution de...
Next, he went on a series of tours of Mediterranean North Africa, striking more favorable deals than the sisters were offering for supplies in Algeria and Morocco.
Mattei believed in the development of Africa, thought the development of Africa would be very quick, would bring a lot of demand for oil, and proceeded with great speed and determination to build up a network of refineries and distribution systems in about 2022 African states, new African states. This is very important. 1960 was the age of independence of Africa, and Mattei was very keen on it. And of course, that was a market in which the multinationals had always got a very good profit out of their barrel. The barrel was small, few barrels were sold, but a very good profit. And competition was not exactly welcome.
But Mattei's major breakthrough came, like that of the Nobel brothers and Marcus Samuel of Shell before him, from Russia. Huge new discoveries had been made in the USSR, and by 1960, cheap Russian oil was available in bulk. Mattei now had the supplies he was seeking, and suddenly the sisters were faced with a price war, not just in Italy, but right across Europe, as the cheap Russian oil undermined their markets. Mattei was now seen as the tiger, challenging the sisters' domination, with plentiful supplies of Russian oil. But he had no illusions about his real strength. Compared to the Sette Sorelle, the Seven Sisters, the Italian company was no tiger, but a helpless kitten, as Mattei described in his favorite story.
Ritornando in questa casa di contadini dove ci riunivamo la sera, la prima cosa che veniva fatta veniva data da mangiare ai cani. E veniva preparato un grande catino di zuppa per questi cani. E io mi stavo togliendo uno stivale e vedevo questi due cani che erano dentro con la testa nel catino e seguitavano a mangiare con voracità. Era una zuppa che forse bastava per 5 cani, non per 2. In quel momento, in un angolo sentii un miagolio e vidi arrivare un gattino grande così, uno di quei gattini dei contadini, magri, affamati, deboli. Avevo una gran paura, si vedeva perché vedeva i cani, però avevo anche una gran fame. E si avvicinò piano piano, miagolando, guardando i cani, e siccome i cani erano immersi con la testa nel catino, il gattino seguitava ad avanzare. Arrivò sotto il catino e con uno zampino lo appoggiò all'orlo del catino. Il bracco tedesco gli diede un colpo, lanciando questo gattino a 3 o 4 metri di distanza, con la spina dorsale rotta. Il gattino visse qualche minuto e morì. E siamo stati il gattino per i primi anni, avendo contro una massa di interessi paurosi. Contro di noi si è sollevata una polemica terribile e abbiamo seguitato a lavorare, a rafforzarci, cercando di non farci colpire. Il tentativo era o di soffocarci o di lasciarci deboli. Piano piano ci siamo rafforzati, lavorando con tenacia. E oggi il gruppo Eni è una grossa forza, è una grande impresa. Una grande impresa che può guardare al futuro con tranquillità e che può fronteggiare vittoriosamente la grande coalizione dei colossi petroliferi.
There's no doubt that psychologically and politically, Mattei did make a great difference. I remember meeting him in Rome in the late 50s, and then one sensed that he was quite different from the ordinary oil company person. He really did believe in the power of a certain institution to break into that field and to dispel the whole mystique of the Seven Sisters. Because, of course, first of all, he had some oil, some gas in Italy itself, and then he used the Russians to get more leverage, and he built up the nationalism of the Italians to break into that very Anglo-American world of the oil companies and to begin to show, in fact, that oil was far more political, far more national than people had suspected.
By 1962, Esso had conceded and were offering to supply Mattei with the cheap oil he needed. It looked as if he had won. The kitten had seemingly found its way to the food bowl. But Mattei had made enemies apart from the oil companies on his drive to power, and he had faced several threats to his life. In October 1962, he made a triumphant trip to Sicily, promising a brighter future for the local people. It was to be his last triumph. On the flight home, his plane crashed in bad weather on its approach to Rome airport. There were no survivors. Inevitably, there was speculation about how he died. Much was made of the fact that he was en route from Sicily. Was there a mafia connection? Were the sisters responsible? Was it just an accident? The newspapers speculated. There had been suspicious incidents involving his plane previously.
His airplane had been sabotaged, a screwdriver had been found in the engine or somewhere. It is difficult to say whether this was a real attempt at sabotaging or just a warning. Very difficult. So this is certain that they had been menaced. Second, the evidence from the plane tells very, very little, almost nothing. The plane crashed on the ground at full speed. It didn't fall, so to speak. It went down the earth at full speed. Its engine was going, and it wasn't short of petrol. And the research done by the official commission was very exhaustive. It excluded explosions, absolutely. It did not exclude either human error or a fainting of the pilot or a kind of much more sophisticated sabotage that couldn't be found because it did leave no traces.
Mattei's legacy was his creation, Eni, the Italian national oil company, which was to become a model state oil company for other consuming nations to set against the Seven Sisters. But more importantly, Mattei had shown the world that the sisters' power could be challenged. However he died, his work was done.
Il gattino seguitava ad avanzare. Arrivò sotto il catino e con uno zampino lo appoggiò all'orlo del catino. Il bracco tedesco gli diede un colpo lanciando questo gattino a 3 o 4 metri di distanza, con la spina dorsale rotta. Il gattino visse qualche minuto e morì.
Persia, the first country in the Middle East to have its oil reserves exploited. Persia, for thousands of years the mountainous barrier between East and West. Persia, first to demand the return of its basic resource, oil. By 1950, the Anglo-Persian Oil Company's refinery at Abadan was the biggest in the world. The refinery township represented the last vestiges of the British colonial lifestyle. Here, Persians learned British ways and British games. and eventually worked in British-controlled oil fields. But outside the oil areas, there was poverty and grave discontent.
Well, I arrived in Tehran as a new boy to the Middle East. I'd never served there before. Some advantage because I had no preconceptions. I didn't know what to expect, but I did feel as I arrived there. Same way as you feel in the half-hour before a thunderstorm. Something was going to burst. Something had to happen. There was electricity in the air. It's hard for me to analyze, but something was going to happen. And, of course, my briefing in London before I left was very simple. Keep the oil flowing. Keep it going for 4 or 5 years. Make sure it's in sterling. Let me get the oil. After that, we'll see what happens. No doubt things will work out, but that is the absolutely basic must. Sterling oil.
The modern story of Persia, or Iran as it's now known, began in 1921, when Reza Pahlavi, a former army colonel, proclaimed himself Reza Shah. But using his alleged sympathies to Hitler as an excuse, the British overthrew him in 1940, and after the war, installed his young son, Mohammed, as Shah. But the young Shah became better known for his marriages to a succession of beautiful women in his attempts to produce an heir than as a strong leader. The strong leader emerging in Iran at the time was Dr. Mohammad Mossadegh, a charismatic nationalist.
It was a very confused situation. On the one hand, national and commercial interests. On the other hand, matters of principle. And finally, a rather stubborn but honest old man fighting for what the rights of his nation as he believed them to be.
Mossadegh conducted much government business from his bed. To Westerners, his Iranian national dress seemed like pajamas. But there was no misunderstanding the enormous appeal he had for the Iranian masses, as he pushed for a fairer share of oil revenues.
I never felt that some people said that he was a clown, a comic actor, or anything else. He was an old-fashioned farmer from Vermont or Devonshire who'd come to market and seen that apples were selling at 25 cents a pound and he was only getting $2 a bushel, and he went mad. I'm being robbed, was his feeling. I'm being robbed, and this cannot go on like that. He didn't understand about the apple market, or indeed the market, but he just felt that he was being robbed.
Amidst growing unrest, Mossadegh appealed direct to the masses, over the head of Prime Minister Razmara. When Razmara was murdered in 1951, the Shah had to appoint Mossadegh Prime Minister. Back in London, the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company warned Iran against nationalizing what they saw as British oil.
Persians think that by nationalizing oil, they are going to get rich. Unfortunately, the reverse will be the case.
Yes, that is Persia's problem. The oil fields produce more than 30 million tons a year, practically all of which must be sold abroad to bring in revenue to keep the organization running.
Oil provided 95% of Iran's revenues, and after the Iranian Majlis, or parliament, had nationalized the oil, Anglo-Iranian responded by threatening to sue anyone who bought oil from Iran, claiming that legally it was British. The American oil majors came to the aid of the sister in distress and refused to trade Iranian crude, thereby cutting off Iran's vital oil exports. Anglo-Iranian turned off the taps, and the tankers off the coast of Abadan lay idle. The Americans made it clear they would not support the use of force.
The American ambassador in Tehran, Mr. Grady, recently paid a call on the Prime Minister to convey a letter from President Truman. It was a message urging Persia to negotiate with the British. Dr. Mossadegh, whose health is apparently not too good, transacts much of his business from his bed, and so it was on this occasion. A strange scene indeed, yet it would be hard to exaggerate the importance of the message or the problem to be solved.
I personally feel that the American ambassador at the time was extremely unhelpful. His name was Grady, and I suppose he was of Irish origin, I don't know. But certainly he was very thick with Mossadegh at the time this anti-British legislation was being rushed through the Majlis.
Recognizing the importance of keeping Iran loyal to the West, America sent Averell Harriman as a special envoy to patch things up between Anglo-Iranian, the Shah, and Mossadegh.
It was certainly suspected among British circles, I can't confirm whether this was true or false, but it was certainly suspected that some of the American oil men were doing their best to undermine the position of the AIOC, perhaps with the ultimate intention of taking over the concession in Iran. And this was a danger which had to be taken seriously into account on the British side. One aspect of that danger, a purely personal one, but one couldn't help noticing, was that one of the undersecretaries in the State Department was, in fact, a man who had a strong personal stake in the American oil industry himself.
But with the oil taps switched off and Iranian national feeling intensifying by the day, the British had no option but to leave.
Families of British technicians being evacuated from Abadan. Even bedridden patients being flown out, and HMS Mauritius standing by in the Shaft El Arab River. Such pictures tell the story of the oil crisis pretty clearly.
As the last remaining employees and wives were evacuated, the ship's band played a defiant rendering of Colonel Bogey. It was the lowest point in the company's history.
I'd been living on the cruiser Mauritius for a week or so, and 13 warships were assembled up the Persian Gulf, but they were all under strictest orders to do nothing, and I was getting quite desperate for my staff and for our undertaking, that nobody seemed to be taking much interest in it.
Meanwhile, Mossadegh was determined to take his case to the United Nations. He impressed many with his eloquence, despite the sour response of the UK ambassador and British newsreels of the day.
There was a densely packed session of the Security Council at New York when Persia's ailing premier, Dr. Mossadegh, arrived on the arm of Mr. Trygve Lie, the United Nations Secretary. Shaky on his pins, but firm enough in his policy, he was opposed by Britain's Sir Gladwin Jett. Dr. Mossadegh, speaking in French, reiterated the Persian attitude to the oil dispute. Sir Gladwin asked Dr. Mossadegh,
although he failed to win financial support from President Truman, Mossadegh won many friends and sympathy for his country's case, and thanked the Americans on television for their hospitality.
Je profite de ces dernières heures de mon séjour aux États-Unis pour exprimer mes sincères remerciements envers la nation américaine qui m'a montré ses meilleurs sentiments, ainsi qu'à ma collègue.
Mossadegh was welcomed back as a hero, first by President Nasser in Cairo, and then at home in Tehran. But it wasn't long before events in Iran were getting out of hand. Mossadegh soon lost the support of the religious ayatollahs. He appealed over the heads of the Majlis to the mobs. In the rioting that followed, the Reza Shah's statue was torn down. British interests in Iran were now in serious danger.
The question of public order was becoming quite a problem, not only in Tehran, but in the provinces. The treasury was empty. Police and army were not being paid. And it was, he didn't have to use it as an element of blackmail. The drift towards communism was there. The only effective party other than the National Front was the Tudeh party, the Communist Party.
Sir George Middleton, chargé d'affaires in Tehran at the time, cabled home. Something had to be done to get rid of Mossadegh. Could a coup be organized?
The important thing seemed to me to be to convince the Americans that what was at issue in Iran was not simply the future of the oil industry. What was at issue was the danger of Iran going through a revolutionary process, a process somewhat similar to what happened in Afghanistan a quarter of a century later. In other words, first of all, a nationalist revolution, then a takeover of the nationalist revolution by the indigenous communists, and finally a takeover of the communist revolution by the Soviet Union.
But the British couldn't organize the coup since they were no longer in control. So a joint British-American plan was drawn up to support the Shah against Mossadegh.
I'm sure that Anglo-Iranian oil companies sympathized with the plan, but they had nothing to do with making the plan. That was made in the first instance by MI6, British Overseas Intelligence. And they produced a very elaborate, detailed plan, which was absolutely worthless. I mean, it was irrelevant. You can't do things that way. And so we accepted it with polite noises of approval and then proceeded to ignore it.
So far as the initial plan was concerned, I never did attach serious importance to it. I thought a Hollywood-style operation might appeal to the Americans. Of course, this was before the days of President Reagan, and I quite understand that from their point of view, it was not practicable.
Through agents, the CIA started to plan the coup. They bribed the Zircani, a famous group of religious strongmen, to lead the revolt against Mossadegh. Kermit Roosevelt, grandson of a former president, masterminded the coup.
Well, our agents were very efficient in the way they organized the bizarre crowd to move on Mossadegh's house. They passed out a little money, not a great deal, and they got the strong men, the Zircani, to lead the march. They are weightlifters, huge men by Iranian standards, and they displayed their muscles and waved some batons around. They didn't take their heavy weights with them, and they really made quite a good demonstration of strength. And they marched on Mossadegh's house, and by the time they got there, he had fled and didn't show up again for another 2 days when he came and turned himself in at a police station.
The mob, organized and paid for by the CIA, had vented its fury on Mossadegh's house. The coup had been a devastating success. The manipulation of the Iranian people by the CIA and MI6 had cleared the way again for the return of the Shah, the West's chosen puppet. The ailing Mossadegh was dragged before Shah, to the obvious delight of British commentators of the day.
In the military court at Tehran, where he's been on trial for treason, the Persian ex-premier, Dr. Mossadegh, demonstrates that he knows how to make an entrance. Clad in his accustomed dressing gown and pajamas, he even makes a dramatic scene out of taking his place in the dock. From this picture, you might conclude that he's a dying man, or at any rate a very sick one. At other times, however, the tribunal has been kept in an uproar, for the aged defendant has constantly challenged the authority of the court to try him. And he's hurled insults at everyone, including the officer appointed to defend him. What a performance!
I never regretted the conclusion of the Iranian mission. I always felt that we were doing in Iran what the people and the army wanted. And as far as I was concerned, that was complete justification.
I would judge it rather in this way, that the success of the operation postponed the Ayatollah's revolution for 25 years. There would have been a revolution of some kind in Iran within a year or two if Mossadegh had not gone. The pity is that the 25 years which were gained by getting rid of Mossadegh were not more effectively used to put the Shah on a proper constitutional course. And I think both British and American governments...
American coup had clearly won back Britain's oil reserves in Iran, and America's reward was a slice of the Iranian oil concession. The new carve-up included for the first time all Seven Sisters. But now there was no doubt about who was actually running the show.
It's a funny thing that when people suggest the Americans outsmarted us, that just as we were not really outsmarted in handing back self-government to the British colonies, we were really saving ourselves a great deal of trouble. The Americans were taking on a bit of trouble rather than outsmarting us in going back with a large share of the oil fields.
I think when the Shah was reinstated and the oil companies, including the Americans, came back in, I think in many ways the Seven Sisters were then pretty well at the peak of their power. Because they'd shown that they could hold together, they could face down Mossadegh, they could get oil from other places like Kuwait, they had plenty of oil in the world, and they defeated the forces of nationalism. Everything really looked pretty good for them, and the governments in the West were on their side. I think it was difficult for them to realize at that time that really Mossadegh was the beginning of the end, because he had really shown the other producing countries that actually oil and nationalism went together, and the fact that he had been defeated didn't mean that other countries couldn't do the same successfully in the future.
The Shah saw oil as the vehicle to modernize Iran on Western lines. The West, particularly America, was happy to sell him arms in exchange for cheaper oil. But increasingly in his own country, he was being seen as a puppet of the West.
I think the Shah was a weak man, but of course, like many weak men, felt the need to show his strength, particularly to his own people. He'd seen to be virtually the stooge to the CIA when he'd been reinstated, and I think it was inevitable that at some stage he would need to assert himself further. And of course, the United States had supported the policy of a surrogate power after 1972, whereby the Shah was really meant to be almost the agent of the United States in building out that military presence in that area.
By now, the Shah was becoming oblivious to what was going on around him. As if to demonstrate the security of his rule, he staged an incredible celebration of 2,500 years of the Peacock Throne at the ancient city of Persepolis. But the celebration of Persepolis was seen by his people as the last throw of a desperate man. Iran was now in serious economic trouble. Its oil revenues were not keeping pace with the country's development. For nearly 20 years, the oil companies had kept from the Shah the fact that they were limiting their uptake of oil from Iran. The sisters remained united against all his demands to take more oil or pay more for it. When he found out about their deception, he was incensed. He joined with the Arabs to lead the drive within OPEC for even higher oil prices. But soon, inflation was rampant in his country. A strike of oil workers cut off his financial lifeline. And as the Ayatollah Khomeini, the exiled religious leader, swept to power, now it was the Americans' turn to be caught up in the fury of the mob. Meanwhile, the Shah, a dying man, fled to America. Khomeini's power base was far stronger than Mossadegh's, and the CIA were now powerless to act.
blindfolded, handcuffed, and marched out on the U.S. Embassy's front step.
President Jimmy Carter, who had greeted the Shah as America's closest ally, had to preside over the shame of American diplomats being held hostage in Iran for 433 long days.
200 days since Iranian students scale the embassy walls and say they only want to hold a protest meeting and leave. The length of the siege might well have dulled the senses, had not the Iranians.
Ayatollah Khomeini was threatening to undermine the economic and political stability of the whole Western world. Carter ordered an attempt to rescue the hostages, then had to endure the further agony of seeing it fail. The Iranians exulted at the wrecked U.S. helicopters strewn over the desert.
Fails, and its failure is used again to inspire a flagging revolution.
When the bags containing the bodies of the dead pilots were put on display in Tehran, it was the lowest point in American prestige since Vietnam. The hostage crisis shocked the world. It also signaled the end of Carter's presidency. The nightmare was complete. Ayatollah Khomeini was back in triumph. America and the major oil companies, the Seven Sisters, were condemned as the great Satans. In 1979, at the end of the most disruptive decade in their history, the Seven Sisters might well have looked back on events in Iran and pondered the words contained in the Old Testament, Daniel chapter 5. For there, the story is told of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, feasting with his courtiers, when an invisible hand wrote on the palace wall, Mene, Mene, Techel Upharsin, which translated read, "Your time is come, your empire will fall to the Persians." The message had come 25 centuries early, but for the Seven Sisters, expelled from their first oil empire in the Middle East, the writing on the wall could not have been more clear. Never in history did any part of the world see such an inpouring of wealth as did the countries of the Middle East in the decade of the 70s. It was as if Aladdin's cave had opened to reveal treasure on an unimaginable scale. It was the decade when the very name Arab seemed to demand the adjective wealthy. With the quadrupling of the oil price in 1973, and a further doubling in 1979, the producing countries of the Middle East went on a vast spending spree. None more so than Saudi Arabia, a country as big as Europe, with a population of only 7 million. There seemed no limit to Arab earning power, even less to their spending power. Previously unimportant little desert sheikdoms around the Arabian Gulf were also wakening up to the real value of their oil reserves. Kuwait, Qatar, Bahrain, the Arab Emirates. Oil would transform economies, for oil was money. Money that would bring the countries around the Gulf into the 20th century. A bright new future had opened up for the whole Arab world. A future which some saw promising more than just economic power,
during the period which starts in the mid-90s and probably takes 2 or 3 decades in the 21st century, most of the exported oil in the world will come from this area. The whole world will depend on this area for this vital commodity. Most of that oil exported from this area will come from Saudi Arabia for the huge reserve we have. This will make Saudi Arabia extremely powerful, economically speaking, and the economical power will bring with it a political power as well.
During the 70s and early 80s, the Arabs' growing political role took shape through the cartel of oil producers, OPEC, 10 of whose 13 members were Middle Eastern countries.
Really?
During the 1970s, the world's press had to grow accustomed to the switch in the balance of power, as OPEC took over the price-fixing role from the oil companies.
Ladies and gentlemen of the press.
What about the Iraqi proposal?
By the late 80s, OPEC's new problem in a world oversupplied with oil and prices slipping has become how to control production and how to discipline its own members cheating on the organization's self-imposed quotas. The burden has fallen heaviest on the biggest producer, Saudi Arabia.
Than what we have done before.
In the 1920s, the tribal states that made up Saudi Arabia had only one source of income, from the Muslims making the Hajj, or pilgrimage, to visit the most sacred sanctuary of Islam, Mecca, the holy city of the Prophet Muhammad. Many had suspected the existence of oil on the Arabian side of the Gulf. After World War I, the Armenian speculator, Calouste Gulbenkian, had acquired 5% of the potential oil revenues from an area he marked on a map with a red pencil. The area covered the whole Arabian Peninsula, as well as the modern countries of Syria, Iraq, and Jordan. This was the so-called Red Line Agreement. But when the warrior chief, Abdul Aziz ibn Saud, united his sprawling Bedouin kingdom in 1932, there was no evidence of the oil wealth to come. The British-controlled Iraq Petroleum Company offered Ibn Saud £30,000 for the Saudi oil concession, an area twice the size of Texas. But persuaded by Sinjan Philby, the father of the British spy Kim Philby, Ibn Saud was also negotiating with Standard Oil of California. They bid £50,000 for the concession, and knowing the king's love of gold, offered it in sovereigns. Ibn Saud took the bait, and the most lucrative oil concession in history went to the United States. When Ibn Saud came to Dhahran in 1938 to turn on the tap that would fill the first tanker with Saudi crude, he couldn't have dreamt what a transformation oil was going to bring to his desert kingdom. America's links with Saudi Arabia were further strengthened when Ibn Saud made his first ever trip out of the kingdom to meet President Roosevelt aboard the U.S. cruiser Quincy. Roosevelt had been attending the historic Yalta summit with Stalin and Winston Churchill at the end of the war. Ibn Saud was also to meet Churchill, but it was already obvious that Britain's role in Arabia was waning. Within a few years, Ibn Saud had agreed that Standard of California be joined by Esso, Texaco, and Mobil to form Aramco, the Arab-American oil company. Britain was to play no part in developing Saudi Arabian oil. In the aftermath of war, the Jews, who saw themselves as the descendants of the people of Canaan, were restored to their promised land with the formation of Israel.
Tel Aviv, key Jewish city, is all rejoicing as the elected head of the provisional government, David Ben-Gurion, arrives to read the proclamation of a new nation, the State of Israel.
A homeland for the Jews had been created in Palestine.
Born in the throes of war, with undefined frontiers, facing Arab opposition, the new state precipitates a world problem.
To create living space for the Jews, the Palestinian Arabs were expelled from their traditional homelands, sowing the seeds of the Arab-Israeli conflict that has lasted ever since.
Abdullah of Transjordan, Farouk of Egypt, and Ibn Saud of Arabia unite the Arab world against the Jewish state.
Arab national consciousness grew directly from the creation of Israel. In Egypt, a charismatic army colonel, Abdul Nasser, had come to power. Nasser understood that oil was the vital nerve of civilization, and much of the West's oil passed through the Suez Canal. He moved quickly to nationalize the canal, a seizure aimed directly at the West.
The Suez Canal, never far from the news in its 87 years of history, hits the headlines like a bombshell, when, without a hint of warning, Egypt's Premier, Colonel Nasser, announces that his country is taking it over. The canal, he says, is nationalized forthwith. The £36 million annual profit will become Egyptian revenue.
The Arabs had found a leader to articulate their growing nationalism. But British Prime Minister Anthony Eden was determined that the West's flow of oil through the canal should continue.
The Suez Canal is a name familiar to everyone. And what Colonel Nasser has just done is to seize it for his own end. Through it travels today about half the oil without which the industry of this country, of Western Europe, of Scandinavia, and of many other countries too, couldn't keep going. This is a matter of life and death to us all.
The British, French, and Israelis decided to take control of the canal by force.
Egypt's seizure of the Suez Canal led to worldwide crisis and the top event of 1956. First, Israeli troops smashed across the Egyptian frontier to wipe out raiding bases in the Sinai Desert. Within days, Port Said reeled under the attack of Anglo-French invasion forces intent on wresting control of the Suez from the Egyptian government. Tanks crumpled the main defenses while ground troops mopped up isolated resistance. Buildings continued to flame after the fighting ceased. The main objective of the invasion, the Suez Canal, was useless, blocked for months by sunken ships.
Nasser's troops were no match for the invading forces, but the Americans recognized the danger the invasion posed to oil supplies and refused to support their traditional allies.
The United States knew much more clearly than the British that this was going to offend Arab nationalism throughout the Middle East. And they knew, which we in Britain did not, that in fact it would be more damaging to security of oil supplies than to actually capture the canal. Because, of course, the real enemy to the oil companies was nationalism and political opposition rather than the question of oil routes and keeping the canal open. The oil companies themselves in Britain advised against any such action and were horrified when it happened. It was a kind of old-fashioned confusion, I think, in Britain, of the idea that by capturing a bit of territory, you therefore had control over the resources, which, of course, you did not.
The British and French were forced out by American, Soviet, and UN pressure, and President Nasser, now a hero for the countries of the Gulf, continued to promote Arab unity. In King Faisal, Ibn Saud's son, he saw a natural ally. Egypt was again the leader of the Arab world, but Saudi Arabia was the wealthiest Arab nation. But another unifying force was also coming into play.
In 1959, Venezuela received an invitation to take part in the first Arab Petroleum Congress. At that Congress, representatives from Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Iran, and the Arab League, as well as Venezuela, met secretly in Cairo. At this meeting, they drew up a document which has become known as the Gentleman's Agreement.
The architects of this gentleman's agreement were the Venezuelan oil minister, Dr. Juan Perez Alfonso, and Abdullah al-Tariki, his Saudi Arabian counterpart. Alfonso returned to Caracas to await agreement for a fully fledged producers' organization. At last, the message arrived from the Middle East.
Perez Alfonso opened the telegram, read it, and all of a sudden, I saw him stand up, wave the telegram in his hands, and he said, "We've achieved it. We are on the way to forming an international oil agreement."
OPEC's original strategy was to conserve oil supplies and keep up prices in a time of glut. But first, it had to learn to speak with one voice. The most persuasive advocate for unity was Tariqi's successor, a young lawyer from Mecca, Ahmed Zaki Yamani. But few took OPEC seriously, as Alfonso's assistant, Alirio Para, recalls.
The major oil companies did not really want to know about the organization. They just did not believe that the organization would last for more than a few months. They did not understand that it was really, that OPEC was really a charter for change.
But at the time, it seemed as if nothing had changed. Certainly not the attitudes of the oil companies.
The older members of the senior hierarchies in the different companies felt that it was a mistake to take the representatives of these producing governments into our confidence in that way, to open up the books, if you will, and disclose the facts, that it was much better to leave them to stumble along to find out for themselves, and that way it would take longer, and perhaps they'd come up with wrong conclusions and therefore be led to do wrong things. It's a perfectly tenable and respectable point of view, and maybe they were right. As I say, it was 10 years before OPEC really became very effective, so perhaps not being very cooperative was the right thing.
But it wasn't OPEC that first forced the major oil companies to start paying more for oil. In June 1967, the Israelis swept across the Sinai and seized positions along the Suez Canal, closing it completely to oil and other traffic. Thousands of Egyptian prisoners were taken as the Arabs faced humiliating defeat. But by 1969, a young army lieutenant was preaching a new brand of Arab fundamentalism in Libya. In the same mold as Nasser, Muammar al-Gaddafi directed his attack at the Western capitalist companies exploiting oil in Libya. Among those capitalists had been Dr. Armand Hammer, the venerable president of Occidental Petroleum. He was close to King Idris, Libya's aged and corrupt monarch, who had agreed to grant Occidental an oil concession in exchange for Hammer finding water near the king's home village of Kufra. Hammer's drillers found the king water in abundance and turned the desert town of Kufra into an oasis. It was enough to win him the valuable oil concession. Hammer's drillers then went on to strike oil in even greater quantities. As a result of the closure of the Suez Canal, Occidental's Libyan oil was now in huge demand. But Hammer's patron, King Idris, had been swept away in the coup led by Colonel Gaddafi, who summoned Hammer to Tripoli to discuss a price increase.
I got this call late at night, and I told Mrs. Hammer that I was leaving immediately. Called the pilot, told him to get the plane ready. Miss Hammer said, "This is one trip I'm not going with you." She said, "The Libyans know you're a friend of King Idris, and you'll probably be arrested. You might even be shot."
اوكسيدنتال هي من ضمن الشركات الاحتكارية والشركات التي تستنزف النفط بدون مراعاة لمصلحة البلد وتستغل الشعب الليبي.
When I got to Tripoli, I looked out the curtains to see whether there were any soldiers to escort me to jail, but there was nobody there except one of our representatives. And he told me that Mr. Jaloud, who was the number 2 man in Libya, would meet me.
وليبيا اختارت الأوكسيدنتال لأن الأوكسيدنتال لم تكن تملك أي نفط خارج ليبيا، وبالتالي هي محتاجة إلى النفط، واخترنا الهدف الضعيف لنحقق عليه نصر تاريخي.
And we sat down at the table to negotiate. He unbuckled his belt and put his revolver on the table while we started negotiating.
طبعا كانت المباحثات صعبة، ولكن كانت تسند على أسس علمية ومنطقية، ونحن لم نستخدم التهديد أو العنف، وحتى لدرجة عندما كنت أتفاوض مع السيد همر كنت أرتدي الملابس المدنية، وكانت المباحثات تأخذ ساعات طويلة، وكان السيد همر إنسان كبير وكان يتعب، حتى أتذكر مرة من المرات طلب مني أن يستريح على الكنبة من التعب.
To avoid giving in to Libyan demands on price, Hammer tried to secure alternative supplies for his customers from the major oil companies, first from Esso, and then by phoning direct to Sir David Barron, chairman of Shell.
Armand Hammer rang me in the middle of one night and put this proposition to me, and he said he was talking to me. I hadn't met him at that time. He said he was talking to me because he thought that Shell might be less inhibited over Department of Justice considerations and so on, and also having very widespread sources of crude might be able to help him more. Well, we were quite disposed to be of assistance, but clearly we couldn't take on the whole burden. So it was a question of trying to get all the companies concerned in Libya and therefore interested in having a firm stand made in Libya to join us.
But despite Shell's efforts, the best the other major companies could offer, if Hammer's Libyan fields were nationalized, was oil at the full commercial rate.
Well, I said, I don't need you to buy oil at market price. And that's when I went to Libya and made this first deal. Otherwise, we surely would have been nationalized. So I think the major oil companies had their opportunity then.
The Libyans had made the breakthrough the other OPEC producers had failed to achieve. Texaco became the first of the majors to bow to the inevitable and accept Libya's price demands. The others quickly fell into line. So, as the balance of power switched from the companies to the producers, Libya launched a program of modernization using its increased oil revenues.
ينبغي أن يأخذ في الاعتبار أن احنا يعني من الثورة 69 حتى الآن قطعنا شوط كبير في التنمية، فوجدت قاعدة عريضة جدا زراعية وصناعية وتقنية وتعليمية وصحية وإسكانية. الحاجات الملحة تم الاكتفاء منها.
And mainly using foreign labor, Gaddafi embarked on major schemes to improve living standards for the Libyan people. Huge building projects were started as the country's whole infrastructure was brought up to date in an attempt to redress the traditional imbalance between the rich West and one of the poorest producer nations. And while Gaddafi was to become a hated figure in the West, his idealism and the undoubted economic improvements in Libya made him a hero at home, where in the arid interior, oil money was also transforming the desert with expensive irrigation schemes.
نحن الحقيقة بمفردنا قمنا بالمبادرة الثورية لكوننا ثوريين. من بعد ذلك وجد المترددون والخائفون وجدوا أن هذا أصبح أمر واقع ومن مصلحتهم مصلحة بلدانهم فانساقوا وراء العاصفة الليبية.
In 1973, Arab-Israeli conflict flared again. Egyptian tanks burst across the Suez Canal, and Israel reeled before the combined onslaught of the Syrians and the Egyptians. But supported by arms from the United States, Israel was soon fighting back fiercely. And while the Arabs were to lose the so-called Yom Kippur War, its outcome was to demonstrate the power of the oil weapon for the first time. The Arab producers united to impose an oil embargo on those nations who had supported Israel. As oil supplies to the West dwindled, Washington tried to boost confidence at home.
America's energy demands have grown so rapidly that they now outstrip our energy supplies. As a result, we face the possibility of temporary fuel shortages and some increases in fuel prices in America. This is a serious challenge, but we have the ability to meet it.
The reality was that the West did not have the ability to meet the challenge. U.S. output had dropped for the first time in a century, and Russia had cut back on its oil exports. Within weeks, motorists were queuing for the dwindling supplies. Filling stations all over the West carried the same bad tidings. And in some European countries, cars were forced off the roads altogether. But much worse was to come. OPEC had now taken over the price-fixing role from the oil companies. In the 5 years after the embargo, oil costing $2.50 a barrel soared to an incredible $40 a barrel. In the words of an oil executive of the day, the West was at the mercy of 6 sheikhs and a shah. And one sheikh in particular was seen as the architect of OPEC's triumph. In the early 70s, Sheikh Ahmed Zaki Yamani, Saudi Arabia's Minister of Petroleum, was seen alternately as the villain or the guiding genius of Arab oil policy, as Western economies reeled before the escalating prices. Now, 10 years later, the West has come to perceive him as a force for moderation. A Harvard-educated statesman of oil, Yamani is as much at home in the West as he is in his palace here in Riyadh. He has other palaces in the kingdom, as well as homes in Britain and Switzerland. But although he's regarded as pro-West, Yamani always acts in Saudi Arabia's best interests. He was quick to take advantage of the shift in the balance of power towards OPEC, as ex-ambassador Jim Akins recalls.
The oil minister met with the oil company executive for some time, and then we had dinner. And then the oil minister sat down to play cards with his friends, and they played cards for hours and hours and hours, about 4 hours or so. Meanwhile, the oil company executive, who had to leave that evening, was fretting, and I asked him whether he had a lot of business to take care of. No, he said it will take 90 seconds. Well, the card game finally ended, and the oil company executive met with the minister, and it did indeed take 90 seconds, and then he left. And I spoke to the minister quite harshly at this, at an apparent rudeness, and he smiled very sweetly and said, "This is the way they treated us in the past, and this is the way we treat them now."
I am very fond of Zaki. I have a very high regard for him, and I think he has been the single most stabilizing force in the industry over the last 10 to 15 years.
I would consider Sheikh Yamani to be one of the really great men of this century. I think he's a very, very remarkable man with a real grasp of economics, a real grasp of world requirements, and as a great saving grace, an enormously good sense of humor.
Well, I think I'm just an oil minister of a country which happened to be well established in this field. I have to be honest with myself and with the others and respect what I say, and probably this is why people, they take what I say seriously, and probably this is why it is effective.
There's no doubt that Yamani does walk an amazing tightrope between the West and the Arab world, as is, if you like, symbolized by his changes of dress between Arab and Western clothes. Because in New York and in America, he is quite close to the oil companies, particularly to Mobil, and he has many Western friends and an ability to project his case to the United States as being constantly, as he would put it, trying to look after Western interests with the cheapest oil possible. Whereas, of course, in the Middle East, he is, at the same time, a national hero, and he has both to project a sense of national pride and not to keep out of line with the royal family. So he is very remarkable in being able to maintain a job for so long with that amazing combination of pressures upon him. And in general, I think he's been very skillful in doing it. Whether he can really keep it up is very uncertain.
Of course, being very powerful is nothing to be very happy about. You have to pay a price for it. And if the present situation between the East and the West will continue, and if the Cold War will remain as it is, then Saudi Arabia will face so many difficulties at that time. But I think we have to live up to that. And we were economically very powerful during the periods of the so-called energy crisis. But later on, I think our power will be a little bit different, much stronger and deeper than what it was during these periods.
A giant statue of a clenched fist in Jeddah seems to symbolize Saudi Arabia's determination to remain strong in this politically unstable part of the world. And as a modern nation has been built on the oil revenues, Saudi Arabia has had to tread a careful path between the tenets of Islam on the one hand and Western consumerism on the other. In the process, some of the most opulent architecture in the world was appearing, much of the construction work carried out by foreign labor. Most of the lucrative building contracts have gone to Western companies. But ordinary Saudis too have seen a dramatic transformation in their standard of living, in housing, social services and education. While holding on to their strict laws on drink, gambling and segregation of the sexes, the Saudis were looking out from under their veils with the confidence born of unlimited wealth. But their gaze, increasingly, was becoming fixed on the customs and the values of the West. In farming too, the Saudis made substantial investments. Few countries have such inhospitable soil. But using specially bred seed and a combination of nitrate fertilizer derived from petroleum and supplies of desalinated water, the Saudis now produce enough grain for their own needs and for export. The whole process is dependent on abundant supplies of cheap oil. Oil was also able to buy education in magnificent new universities that sprang up all over the Gulf. Oil could provide water, millions of gallons of the second most precious fluid in the Middle East, by fueling desalination plants to turn salt water into fresh. Oil could even buy a lifestyle, whereby devout young Muslims seemed able to absorb aspects of Western culture and still stay true to their faith. At the Petroleum University near Dhahran, 3,000 Muslim students learn about the world's most advanced petroleum technology. Here, the Muslim students are as familiar with high-tech computer readouts as they are with the Quran itself. But it's in religion that the greatest tensions have come, not only for Saudi Arabia, but for the other oil-rich Gulf states as well. Each year, around 2 million Muslims from all over the world make the Hajj, or pilgrimage, to Mecca, to pay observance to the fundamental rules of the Islamic religion. But in 1979, there was an attack on the Grand Mosque, which for Saudi Arabia, as guardian of the holy sites, was like an attack on the kingdom itself. A band of Saudi Shiites, protesting against the departure from traditional Islamic values and allegedly funded from Iran, took control of the mosque. After a bitter gun battle, the fundamentalists were eventually overpowered. The 73 captives were tried and summarily executed. But their protest highlighted the growing split at the heart of the Islamic faith. The problem for the ruling House of Saud has been to what extent a modern world power can afford to relax the Quranic laws without offending the kingdom's more devout Islamic subjects, and especially the Bedouins, who see their traditional lifestyle under siege from oil wealth and westernization. Modern Saudi Arabia was born from the desert. Now the Bedouins pose a serious internal problem. Always fiercely independent and difficult to unite, they have resisted the drive to modernity. The camel, not oil, is their main source of income, now as it has been for the last 3,000 years. By contrast, His Royal Highness Prince Abdullah bin Faisal bin Turkey, a grandson of Ibn Saud, symbolizes the kingdom's dominant role among the world's petrostates. A royal technocrat, he's keenly aware that all is not right in the world's wealthiest technocracy. With the drop in oil prices, 2 of the kingdom's new refinery projects have had to be cancelled, to the growing concern of the managers of the Saudi petrochemical industry and their Secretary General, Prince Abdullah. After billions were invested in the latest plant, Prince Abdullah has seen Saudi petrochemical exports slump and refined products pile up unsold as the kingdom has failed to break into Western markets.
I mean, what has been put into the, say, the 2 industrial cities of Jubail and Yambo, which are mainly geared for huge petrochemical primary products, most of it actually went to the industrial West. I mean, I think 80% of our expenditures in Jubail and Yambo, which if you take infrastructure and the factories and the plants, was something around maybe $40 billion. 80% of that went almost to the Big 6 or the OECD countries. And now, of course, they're not being very helpful with the marketing of our products. It's quite a disappointment.
During the early 80s, Saudi Arabia was producing over 10 million barrels of oil a day, and the tankers queued at the world's biggest terminal, Ras Tanura, to take it away. But by 1985, the kingdom had cut production to 2 million barrels a day in an attempt to support falling prices. The Saudis warned other OPEC producers to honor production quotas, or they would turn on their oil taps. With growing financial troubles of their own, there was a limit to how far even they could go as swing producers, cutting back output to accommodate overproduction by other OPEC members. But some of them failed to cut back, and new producers like Britain and Norway refused to cooperate. With a rapidly falling share of oil markets, Sheikh Yamani, in December 1985, spelled out a clear warning.
We will open our valve, and then it's like an electrical shock. Everybody will realize that what happened is a mistake. And when I say everybody, it's not the producers only, the consumers themselves.
Within days of the Saudis increasing production, oil prices started to slide. Finally, on March the 31st, 1986, the so-called Black Monday, prices dropped from $30 3 months earlier below the psychological barrier of $10 a barrel. It looked as if Yamani's predictions of economic chaos were coming true.
There will be a banking crisis in Great Britain and in America. There will be a serious problem in so many areas. And all these things together will make everybody realize that oil is not an ordinary commodity, and we have to deal with it in a different way.
But within OPEC itself, there was a sharp division about the wisdom of the Saudi tactics, because amongst those hardest hit by the falling prices were some of the poorest OPEC producers themselves. The worried ministers gathered at OPEC's headquarters in Vienna. Especially hard hit was Iran, trying to finance its war with Iraq. Iran saw the increased Saudi production as a deliberate tactic to drive down the price, thereby reducing Iran's ability to deliver the knockout blow on Iraq. While the oil ministers of the two warring countries faced one another down across the negotiating table, the gap between Iran and Iraq was wider than ever after 6 years of conflict. In the drawn-out holy war, neither Iran or Iraq seems capable of gaining a lasting military advantage. With their oil income dwindling, both sides have had to struggle to sustain the war. Saudi Arabia supports Iraq economically and politically, but although the Saudis haven't had to fire a shot in the conflict, the kingdom's defense budget is easily the highest in the Gulf. With a serious reduction in oil income, not even the Saudis can sustain a long-term drop in price. For decision makers like Prince Abdullah, it's time to face up to the new realities. For major decisions now face the Desert Kingdom. In the past decade, it has grown accustomed to a rich diet. Many Saudis themselves believe the kingdom has become bloated, that it's now time for simpler fare.
We have some camel milk and some buttermilk. Who prefers what?
As the economic leader of the Arab world, it must also face up to the political responsibilities of its oil wealth and the effects of its policies on future generations of young Arabs. For now, the gamble to increase production has just about broken even. While Yamani's move seems to have brought the overproducing OPEC members reluctantly into line, Western economies, far from collapsing, have revived as a result of cheaper oil. 5 years ago, bolstered by its oil wealth, Saudi Arabia was able to bring moral and political weight to the Gulf states. But the real test for the Arab countries will come over the next 5 years, as they try to cope with unstable oil prices, slower development, as well as the growing problem of Islamic revolution. So can Saudi Arabia's blend of Islam with Western consumerism act in any way as a model for the Arab world? Or will the Gulf petrostates prefer to hold to the literal truths of the Quran? Even more crucial, can the West learn from past mistakes and face up to the fact that within a decade it will again be dependent on the Middle East for oil supplies? And what action should be taken now to avoid another oil shortage in the 1990s? It's answers to questions like these that will reveal the lasting significance of OPEC's hard-won Charter for Change. In the meantime, the cartel's best-known visionary is already predicting the shape of things to come.
Oh, I am definite that what happened in the 70s will happen again because of what's happening today. A low price of oil, a drop in the price of oil. And this will change the pattern of supply and demand. This will reduce reserves and also stop any alternative sources of energy or an increase in finding alternative sources of energy.
Mañanitas que cantaba el rey David.
For Mexico, after centuries of exploitation, it seemed as if a new day had dawned, with major offshore oil finds and rising oil prices in the 1970s. The country's newfound wealth could be seen in the modern buildings of the capital city's business center, La Zona Rosa. The Angel of Independence looked on approvingly from her perch high above. The helicopters, transporting the roughnecks and roustabouts from the main base at Carmen in the Gulf of Mexico, throughout the 70s symbolized the technological drive of the new offshore industry. Now, Mexicans who had grown up in the oil business were manning the drill rigs and production platforms. The Yankees, or gringos, who'd pioneered Mexico's onshore oil business, had gone home. Offshore, the Mexicans had done it themselves. It was a triumph for a proud nation, the first to take control of its own oil reserves as far back as 1938. Here, in the oil-rich waters of the Gulf of Mexico, the state oil company calls the tune, Petróleos Mexicanos, better known as Pemex. In Mexico, Pemex is more than just an oil company. From its gleaming tower high above Mexico City, Pemex represents the nation's faith in its premier resource. Many see the head of Pemex as the most powerful Mexican, next to the president himself.
Pemex has grown. We are now the fourth largest producer of oil in the world. We are also the fourth largest exporter. So we are an important participant in the oil market. Pemex is the most important supplier of foreign exchange for this country. We are also the most important contributor to the public finances of Mexico. We are by far the highest, the most important taxpayer in this country. So if the revenues of Pemex would suffer a substantial drop, that would mean that we would not be able to keep on contributing in the very high proportions that we do today to the public finances of Mexico and to the equilibrium of our balance of payments.
But below the Pemex tower, the reality of Mexico's plight can be seen in the world's largest urban slum, Mexico City. Now, building projects stand half-finished. Loans from American and World Banks remain unpaid. As if the problems of traffic and pollution weren't enough, collapsing oil prices in the early 80s trapped the Mexican people in a giant debt crisis. The capital city symbolizes the problems facing the whole nation. As oil prices slumped, Mexico could not even pay the interest on its borrowings. In the world's most polluted city, Some eked out a living among the exhaust fumes, trying to sell unnecessary items to motorists in the eternal traffic jams downtown. The fire eater spews out his own contribution to the pollution problem, finding no nourishment from the fire he seems to feed on. Ordinary Mexicans benefited little from the oil boom of the 70s. The old woman selling dolls to the tourists knows little and cares even less about shrinking oil revenues, or why the banks, who so willingly handed out money 10 years ago, are now tightening their grip. Mexico's current foreign borrowings are nearing $100 billion, the largest in the world. Much of the debt is owed to the United States, and American banks are heavily involved.
And we have to remember that in the 1970s, there were many people, including governments, which urged countries to borrow and banks to lend. This was in those days known as the recycling of the oil surpluses. It was a period of very high interest rates, and gradually the debt shifted from fixed-term lending to floating interest rate lending, which meant the debt became more expensive as the industrialized countries undertook an anti-inflationary program, which was very successful, but also served in its initial stages to push up interest rates.
In just 2 years, Mexican buying power slumped by 25%. Unemployment is so high, there are no official figures. But not all Mexicans are poor. As well as the traditionally wealthy families, there is a new bourgeois elite which has taken its share of the inflowing petrodollars, either to invest in grand estates, or more usually, to take it out of the country to the USA or further afield. In Mexico City's smart quarter of Los Lomas, there is ample evidence behind the closed gates of the gap between the poor and the rich, and even the super rich. So where did things start to go wrong for Mexico? And to what extent has oil been more of a curse than a blessing?
There is no question that oil improved the port capacity of the country, permitted us to improve the steel production of the country, that permitted us to build more roads and more highways and more storage facilities. In that sense, I think it was a very positive and a very active factor that explains what happened in the Mexican economy in the recent past.
But Mexico City is only the polluted public face of a nation whose 75 million people still live mainly in the country areas. In the Tabasco province, the oil industry is a daily reality. Once, the peasant farmers could supplement their income by catching a few fish in the local creeks and lagoons. Tabasco is rich in agriculture as well as oil. Senor Joaquin Coronel and his family make a living from raising a few animals and growing fruit. In the boom days, many peasants like Coronel were attracted to the oil industry for higher wages. Now, most have lost their jobs. And with inflation rising and the oil industry in decline, the local industries cannot employ them either.
Ve, corta otra. La que esté más sazón, esa, ve. Dale vuelta. Ahora.
For the Coronel family, it's becoming harder to make ends meet.
Hay que saber llevársela, porque si no, nos vamos a morir, nos morimos de hambre, pues. Y ahí con los pocos animales que tiene la familia, que ella se mera pues a mantenerlas aquí para que produzca, para que comamos nosotros.
O
para vender, al menos ahorita, pues.
Cualquier cosa, pues siempre.
Hace falta el maíz ahorita que no hay, pues.
También, pues siempre cuando hay algo de urgencia, pues tenemos que vender un puerco, un cerdo, para desempeñarnos las deudas.
El precio de todos los bastimentos, pues, que se agarran para el beneficio de la casa. Tanto de sí, el gas, el aceite, el azúcar, el frijol, el arroz y todo eso. Pues es una cosa que ya aumentó y hay que ver cómo le hacemos, pero tenemos que tenerlo porque si no, ¿de qué vamos a...? Gracias a Dios, pues, ahí hemos ido un poco más o menos, ni más ricos ni más pobres. Ahí nos mantenemos en un nivel que sí nos da para vivir, gracias a Dios.
Pues lo que está más es por el aceite de que se vanan su ropa. Y siempre cuesta la lavada sacándole el aceite con petróleo o gasolina a modo de desmanchar la ropa. Porque la cruzada del aceite pues mancha la ropa, lo pone negra. Pues para mí digo yo que el aceite y el gas es malo. Es malo, porque puede contaminarse uno también. Pues yo digo así, ¿verdad?
At peasant level, life has always been a crisis in Mexico. Now the Coronels can only hope things improve as oil continues to blight the family's prospects. Apart from its hot sauce, Tabasco was famous for its cocoa and chocolate. But in the push for industrialization in the wake of oil, its traditional industries have slumped. Falling oil prices presented the central government with new dilemmas for the rural areas. Will they be able to go back to traditional businesses which have been neglected for so long? Tabasco is one of the richest agricultural provinces in Mexico, but local products and producers have suffered the increasing priority given to oil and the oil industry. Deprivation is nothing new for Mexico. The country's history reads like a serial of exploitation. The Aztecs, a proud Indian nation, were conquered by the Spaniards. The French and Germans continued the exploitation. Later, it was the gringos from the north. The church was often seen to be in collusion with the exploiters. But in 1911, a new era dawned, when the liberal Francisco Madero became Mexico's first independent president, bringing to an end the 40-year dictatorial rule of Porfirio Diaz. But Madero couldn't control the competing aims of Britain and America for Mexican oil, and he was assassinated, allegedly with the involvement of U.S. Ambassador Henry Lane Wilson. During this period, relations with her powerful neighbor to the north continually threatened Mexico's fragile independence, an independence symbolized by the statue El Ángel de Independencia, overlooking the center of Mexico City. In 1914, President Woodrow Wilson sent warships off the coast of Mexico, claiming that an American naval officer had been illegally arrested in the city of Veracruz. But President Venustiano Carranza withstood American pressure. And in 1917, he forced through important land reforms and inserted into the Constitution paragraph 27, securing the mineral rights, and especially petroleum, as Mexican national property. But the first decades of the 20th century saw Mexico in almost continuous turmoil, as the United States and Britain used the country as a kind of stage for playing out their ambitions to gain control of Mexican oil. Oil had been found seeping to the surface in many parts of Mexico before the turn of the century. By the early 1900s, the first speculators were moving in. One of the promising areas was Tampico, in the swamplands of southern Mexico. In the early rush for leases, every means, including murder, was used to cheat the land away from the local peasants. In this film reconstruction, a Mexican peon is shot and his fingerprint used to seal a false land transfer document. It was the quest to find fuel to power the engines for the new Mexican Central Railroad that had first attracted the American inspectors. Both American and British oil companies struck oil in commercial quantities very early. The first Englishman to explore the possibilities was a mining engineer from Yorkshire. He had been working in Mexico and visited the famous Spindletop strike in East Texas. His name was Wheatman Pearson. If there was oil on the north side of the Gulf of Mexico, Pearson deduced that it existed on the south as well, and he immediately started buying leases. But it wasn't until 1908 that he brought in his first gusher at Dos Bocas. Pearson's Aguilla company was now rivaling Standard Oil, who had bought out the first successful American wildcatter, Ed Doheny. It was the Dos Bocas strike that introduced Mexico to the motor age. Pearson was later created the First Lord Cowdrey. The family estates in Sussex and Scotland run to 70,000 acres. The Cowdreys sold out their Mexican oil interests to Shell and are now among the top half-dozen wealthiest families in Britain. Wheatman Pearson, the founding father, is buried here in a quiet Aberdeenshire churchyard. The family motto is, "Do it with thy might." The family business, founded on Mexican oil, now covers engineering, publishing, and communications. But while foreigners did indeed develop Mexican oil with all their might, the Mexican people saw little of the wealth. During the 1930s, a series of strikes rocked the country as oil workers protested about pay and conditions. Finally, in 1938, President Lázaro Cárdenas declared Mexican oil nationalized.
Respuesto y con fundamento en el párrafo segundo de la fracción sexta del artículo 27 constitucional y en los artículos primero, cuarto, octavo,
Using Article 27 of the Constitution, he sent in the troops to take over the oil fields. The oil companies were forced to leave. To popular acclaim, Mexico became the first country to found its own national oil company, Petróleos Mexicanos, later to become internationally known as Pemex. It looked as if Mexico had removed the grasping foreign hands from its oil riches. But the major companies promptly boycotted Mexican oil. By the start of the war, the only customers left were the fascist powers of Germany, Italy, and Japan. During the war, Mexico's oil exports virtually came to a halt. The major companies forced it to pay crippling compensation before they would again purchase Mexican oil. After the war, many of the older fields had been overexploited, and Mexico was forced again to accept American technology to help boost flagging production. Mexico's first 50 years of domination by foreign oil companies had left a bitter aftermath. But when the search for new fields moved offshore, there were further setbacks. The Ixtoc blowout in 1979 lasted more than a year and spewed millions of tons of oil into the sea. To many, the catastrophe seemed to symbolize Mexico's desperate rush for development, to cash in on the rising oil prices during the 70s.
Oil permitted Mexico to grow during 1978 to 1981 at one of the fastest rates of growth in the world. We averaged more than 8% in real terms. But after that, and by a combination of elements, both domestic and foreign, we faced in 1982 one of the most severe crises, economic and social crisis, that the country has faced in the last half of a century.
Mexico had borrowed too heavily while oil prices were rising. As prices slumped, financial chaos loomed. The country was unable to service its massive loans.
We are not a charitable organization. If a country has a raging inflation, if it subsidizes, say, agriculture, as many countries did, keep prices to the farmers low, which means they have no incentives to grow more product, turn around and import food, if they do not allow an investor to make a profit and therefore they have no investment and then turn to the public sector for investment and that public sector enterprise loses money rather than makes a profit. If they keep the prices for bread unchanged for 20 years, if they continue to sell gasoline at 35 cents a gallon where the rest of the world pays $2 a gallon, we clearly have to ask ourselves whether we can justify to ourselves, to our board, to our shareholders, to our bondholders, lending substantial amount of money to that country.
But it wasn't only Mexico's economy that was under strain. So was its vaunted state oil company, Pemex. A gas explosion on the outskirts of Mexico City in 1984 devastated a wide area, killing many and making thousands homeless.
Sobrevino la tercera explosión.
The government was quick to clear away the visible evidence of the catastrophe, but the growing signs of official incompetence were not so easy to cover up. Pemex had been warned about gas leakages by those living nearby. Critics demanded to know why no action had been taken when the gas was first smelled. Now the smell of corruption hung over the state oil company. The Oil Workers' Union, the strongest in Mexico, gathers for its 18th convention. Among the assembled officials is Don Fidel Velázquez, the top union leader. The country's government and union chiefs, as well as top Pemex officials, are waiting to listen to Mexico's president, Miguel de la Madrid. Within Pemex and the wider political field, power in Mexico increasingly has become vested in the unions. The president has come to reassert the unity between government, the labor movement, and the national oil company.
Esta ocasión es propicia para que reafirmemos la gran importancia que tiene la industria petrolera en México en estos momentos. Sigue siendo el petróleo, como lo ha sido desde Lázaro Cárdenas, columna vertebral de la vida mexicana. Seguiremos manteniendo el estricto nacionalismo de la industria petrolera mexicana. Y para ello, como lo ha señalado Joaquín Hernández Galicia, tenemos un compromiso conjunto. El gobierno, la administración de la empresa y el sindicato petrolero. De Petróleos Mexicanos, una empresa de la que todos nos podamos sentir confiados y orgullosos. Una empresa que siga sirviendo de palanca para elevar la historia de México en todos los aspectos. Yo sé que lo podemos hacer.
But not all shared President de la Madrid's grand vision. Alberto Castillo, head of the opposition Mexican Workers' Party, is a former Pemex engineer. He has been one of the present regime's fiercest critics and is currently waging a campaign against corruption in the Oil Workers' Union. He leads a small but dedicated group of anti-government activists from his party's modest headquarters in mid-Mexico City.
En Pemex, el sindicato petrolero es de los más corruptos que hay en el país. Yo diría que puede ser el nido de la corrupción. Los dirigentes actuales son unos gángsters verdaderos. Ellos son culpables de delitos que la voz del pueblo les ha reclamado, desde robos, secuestros, asesinatos, y han sido sancionados por el presidente de la República y han sido felicitados ante la televisión.
A key figure in the country's power structure is Don Fidel Velázquez, leader of CTM, the National Union of Workers. Velázquez is on the select group which chooses presidential candidates, or in effect, presidents, since the ruling party, the PRI, always wins elections. He provides the unity between the government and the workers. How does he react to allegations of corruption within the unions?
Indudablemente que en nuestra institución, como en cualquier otra, hay casos aislados de inmoralidad que también nosotros atacamos, y los atacamos de una forma muy práctica. Cuando un líder no sirve con lealtad a sus miembros, ese líder es desplazado inmediatamente, porque aquí no tenemos ningún formulismo.
El agente del Ministerio Público Federal, Manuel Ramírez Espinosa.
Corruption is a recognized fact of public life in Mexico. When the present government came to power, it promised to crack down on corruption in high places.
Y dos comandantes del Grupo Anticorrupción de la Procuraduría General de la República. Se informa a los periodistas.
Among the early victims was El Negro Durazo, Mexico City's former head of police.
Las acusaciones que se presentarán en contra del señor Durazo son las siguientes. 1.
In a kind of pseudo-acropolis outside the capital, Durazo had a private casino and a bull ring. He also had millions of dollars lodged in U.S. banks.
Creo que esta cosa de Díaz Serrano y del Negro Durazo es para exportación. Esto es para que fuera de México se piense que hay un proceso de renovación moral. Pero yo diría que esto no es cierto. Pero además, la renovación moral la han limitado a ciertas personas a las cuales se les ha querido ejemplificar como deshonestos. Pero los más grandes corruptos en México andan sueltos y tienen grandes influencias.
Few have the courage of Alberto Castillo when it comes to criticizing the government. He deliberately cultivates a high profile as his only defense against assassination.
Pues sí, tengo la protección pues de una opinión pública. Por eso no traigo guardaespaldas y mi única protección pues es la imagen pública que se puede tener, y el que siempre digo que si algo me pasa, la responsabilidad es del presidente de la República.
Castillo has survived threats and physical attacks. He has spent years in jail, but still he fights on. As a one-time employee of Pemex, his criticism of the state oil company and its policies are particularly savage. But Mario Ramon Beteta, the Director General, defends his restructured company.
It is necessary to manage, to administer oil activities in general, primary production and transformation and commercialization, more carefully and in a more austere way. And that is what we are trying to do without really blaming it on our predecessors that they did not act the way they should have.
As part of Pemex's new image, stricter environmental controls have been introduced offshore. Mindful of previous disasters, the new administration has taken a strong line on pollution. Now visitors are proudly shown round the nesting places of wild birds on an island among the offshore installations in the Gulf. But Pemex's critics are less convinced that the oil company's in-house activities have been cleaned up, despite the fact that Beteta's corrupt predecessor has been clapped in jail. Now, most of Mexico's oil comes from the new offshore discoveries made in the 70s. As prices have collapsed, Mexico has had to increase production, pumping the crude directly into the waiting tankers for transshipment to the foreign markets. But as sales have slumped in the world glut, the oil is also being pumped into storage, and many refineries which provided valuable local employment are winding down. Now, unemployed oil workers joined the other jobless, traveling by bus from their home districts to add to the teeming millions in Mexico City. With an estimated population of 20 million, the Mexican capital is already the world's biggest city. Its creaking administration and social system have all but collapsed under the sheer weight of people seeking work and a place to live. Most of the new arrivals end up in one of the many shanty towns in an ever-growing poverty belt around the capital. Here, people consider themselves fortunate to have a roof over their heads and a few pesos to buy food. When a shanty town has existed long enough to be accepted as a new district of the city, rudimentary water and electricity supplies begin to catch up. Mexicans have learned to be philosophical about such things as they try to cope with unemployment and soaring inflation. For some, there is escape in tequila. Apart from inflation and threatening economic problems, Mexico has an alarmingly high birth rate due to the inevitable lack of birth control. Every year, some 2.5 million new Mexicans are added to the 75 millions already striving to survive. Typical are Señor Alegría and his neighbor, Señora Cuca.
Pues éramos muy pobres, muy humildes. A veces comíamos y a veces no. Entonces me vine acá para México con el fin de trabajar y mejorar la vida. Sí, ha mejorado. Me he dado cuenta que sí ha mejorado.
Con la diferencia de que pues uno económicamente, en lugar de ir adelante, pues hay veces que va uno un poco más atrás. Porque todo va subiendo y ahora sí que su presupuesto de uno es el mismo. Y todo va encareciendo, todo se le va haciendo a uno más difícil la situación. Sí.
Señora Cuca's sister has done well in difficult times. She runs a little tortilla bar round the corner from the family home. But in Mexico, there is always light as well as darkness. The nation's greatest strength perhaps lies in the resilience of its people. On a Sunday afternoon,